My name is Woody Walker, and I'm a graduate student in the Virginia Commonwealth University Department of History. My graduate thesis is titled Recovering Lost Voices, the Rappahannock Tribe and the Jamestown Festival of 1957. My guest and narrator today is Jamie Ware Jandro of the Rappahannock Tribe, and we are at her home in Williamsburg, Virginia. Actually, we're in Norwich, aren't we? Got it. This oral history explores Rappahannock tribal history, particularly during the 20th century, and ideas of cultural preservation, diaspora, and places of origin. Through Recovering Lost Voices, we hope to uncover the memories and meaning the Rappahannock people attach to events like the 1957 Jamestown Festival. Ms. Jandro, thank you very much for being here today.
Thank you for being here, Woody.
I want to begin with just kind of tell me about yourself. I want some background, some biographical details. When and where were you born? Tell me about your siblings. Tell me who were your parents.
I was born in the Medical College of Virginia in 1959 to my parents, James and Doris Nelson Ware, I had two siblings, Deborah K. Ware and Sonia Dale Ware. Both are deceased. We have been living in Williamsburg. We had been living in Williamsburg even before I was born in 1957. And still, I live here today as the only living relative of that family. I have two daughters from my family, one from my marriage to Robert Anthony Jandro, and my other daughter I claim is my sister's child who lost her mother many years ago. So they're both on their own. They're very adult children living on their own, so I've enjoyed the time I've had here to myself, working and taking care of my home.
And tell me their names, the daughters.
My daughter's name is Mino Jandro, and my sister's child, who is also my daughter, is Tashina Moore. And
your husband, Robert, tell me about his background. He was a veteran of the military?
Yes, he's 26 years U.S. Air Force, and when he retired from Desert Storm, he landed at Langley Air Force Base and started attending and working at the Hampton University Museum, and attended as a student there. It's where I met him, and we made a history there, and we married on the campus and both got our degrees from Hampton University.
And what was his tribal affiliation?
Bob is from the Keweenaw Bay Indian Reservation in upstate Michigan on the Barriger Reservation, where he's buried at today.
Okay. So your family has multiple connections to Native American heritage.
Absolutely. All of my life, from the time that I was born up until present, my families have been involved with their culture and cultures of other Native tribes. I started dancing when I was 15 years old, and my first powwow was the Halawasa Pony Powwow in North Carolina. And from that point on, I began dancing, and I've been dancing ever since.
When did you start?
I was 15.
Okay. Wow, that's just amazing. I love it. Okay, I want to explore some of your memories about the role of the Rappahannock people in the Jamestown Festival of 1957. How did your family and other tribal members first get involved? Tell me about your parents getting involved and how that happened.
Their knowledge to me was an invitation was extended to all the tribes in Virginia to come and participate in Jamestown's history and tell the oral history there. My parents took the bite and left King and Queen County and were the first Native history interpreters at Jamestown Festival Park in 1957. At that time, they needed added history interpreters on the weekends, so my uncle Captain and Aunt Gladys were invited in to come as well and give the weekend history there, doing the same thing. And additional, on the day when the park opened, May 7th, I think it was, in 1957, my mother became ill. And so my Aunt Ethel was invited to come in. So the five of them made the first history at Jamestown as interpreters, making the crafts and interpreting the history.
Thank you. Now, when were you born?
I was born in 1959.
So you don't have memories of being there. This is some stuff and memories that your parents shared with you.
Only in books. I had lots of magazines that my father had gathered over the years of like covers of Virginia magazines where he made world history, interpreting the Jamestown history. And so I had pictures, and as I was going through college and after, I did interpretive work in the school systems, and I would share all those pictures of him at Jamestown.
Well, it's a fascinating story. What kind of things did your family do? I know they worked as history interpreters, interpreting not just Rappahannock history,
Right.
Algonquin culture. Have I got that terminology correct?
That is correct.
And what kind of things did they do?
Our mom actually was hired there to interpret in the village, and they would show the people, the guests who would come in, how they grinded corn to make the meal, how they would tan the hides to make the clothing for them to wear, and the skins that kept on their beds. And Dad would also be working as in the hut to scare the crows away from the corn, because they planted their gardens there. They showed how they did the slash and burn corn, and they would how they had their agrarian life in the Indian village. In addition to making fish traps, dug out canoes, arrowheads. He did a lot of the crafts there, as well as my mom.
There's some really amazing photos of your family members, not just your parents, your aunts and uncle as well. Mm-hmm. Some of the photos that I see of your father and mother, I can see that they took a lot of pride in the fact that they were working there.
Yes.
Well, it can be seen. Do you recall Dr. Ben McCary from the College of William and Mary?
Again, I was very young, but only through a lot of ethnohistory and photographs and things that my parents had, and the documents that he did I know of him.
One of the things I'm interested in is the development and construction of what they called Powhatan's Lodge back in 1957. Mm-hmm. And so I'm curious about your father's role or other Rappahannock tribal members, their role in helping. I know Dr. McCary had a role in designing that lodge. I'm curious about the role that tribal members played.
Prior to the grand opening of Jamestown Festival Park, my family came down to include all of my family, my aunts and uncles, and helped to build the Indian village there that housed 30 people, at least 5 or 6 families. So it was a long Indian lodge that they lived in, and they showed to the public, to the visitors, how they were able to live a life there in the winter months and the summer months. But Dad and Mom were very instrumental in starting that.
Drawing upon resources like Frank Speck's 1925 book about the Rappahannock people, I believe that the Rappahannock people brought cultural knowledge and authenticity to Powhatan's Lodge in 1957. Do you agree with that?
I do. They demonstrated to the public through interpretive work and also through demonstration of how they live daily lives of baking their fish on the grill, or using the stones to grind the corn or make the arrowheads or tan the hides, to have in the beds to live. They demonstrated that during the day as they interpreted the work. So they were in a living village that which the work they interpreted daily.
So how did your family have these skills? How did they know these things? Were they passed down from their fathers and grandfathers?
Absolutely. They were all very rural agrarian people, and generally came from the King and Queen Caroline area, and they had lived learning how to make fish traps and canoes and arrowheads, and learning how to fish not from Bass Pro Shop, but making those arrowheads and using bamboo poles to fish in the lakes that we had, in the rivers.
What kind of work did your parents do prior to coming to Jamestown?
Both were farmers. My maternal grandfather was a farmer, and he used mules to plow with. And my mom told me stories of how she would go out with him as a little girl and help plow the fields to grow the produce that we had that Grandma canned. My dad was also the same. On his land, it was all using not your big farm oil tractors today or the John Deeres, but they had mules to plow the land with. So they both came together with the same skills.
And when did your parents meet, and how did they meet, and when did they get married? Did this happen in the 1940s, early 50s?
My parents, they were both born in 28. Mom a little older than Dad, but they were both farmers, and Dad was tasked to come down, invited to come down by my grandfather to work on his farm.
And what was your grandfather's name?
Judge Nelson.
Mm-hmm.
He wasn't a judge, but that was his name. He came down to work on the farm for my daddy Judge, because that's what everybody called him. And when he came down, he would help him work in the fields and harvest the produce and everything that went to market and went for sale. And in so doing, he met my mom, who was very flirtatious, and they fell in love and got married.
And what year did they get married?
They got married in 1948.
1948. So they'd been married a while before they came to Jamestown.
Absolutely.
Okay. Well, thank you for sharing that with me. I think that part of the value of interviews like this is to capture some of that family history for people in the future when they want to look back. Some of the Rappahannock tribal members might want to look back and know a little bit more about Judge Nelson and James Ware and those Nelson girls, Gladys, Doris, and Ethel.
That's correct.
Wow, fascinating story.
Very vivacious people.
Tell me about your family and others from the Rappahannock tribe working at Jamestown after the 1957 festival. I understand there were Rappahannock people working there well into the 1960s. I want to know more about who did that and what kind of work they were doing.
Well, my mom continued to work there as a seamstress during the winter months. So she was tasked to make the 17th century costumes, and she did have a seamstress with her who was Portuguese seamstress in the sewing room. And during the winter months, they would make all the 17th century costumes and then also make the native regalia. Preparing for the winter months, they would make the winter outfits and then the breech cloth and the off-the-shoulder dresses for the for the spring months.
Okay, now I want to back up a little bit. It's 1957. Your parents come to work there. Was this a part-time job, full-time, 5 days a week? What was their work schedule like?
Well, my parents were the first interpreters to go, and then of course they needed weekend helpers. So then my Uncle Captain and Aunt Gladys and Lou Ethel came. But of course Lou Ethel came the day the park opened because my mom was sick. So Lou Ethel and my mom Doris and my father Jim, running there, they worked Monday through Friday. And then Gladys and Captain Nelson were there on the weekends as weekend relief. So we all kind of lived together in the same house, and they would come down and stay with us on the weekends.
You mentioned your father's Indian name of Running Deer.
Yes.
Now, in some of the literature that I've seen, especially from the 60s and early 70s, they call your dad Chief Running Deer. And I'm curious about that because I'm wondering if that is like a stage name, or was Running Deer his, Indian name? Tell me more about that.
It was a stage name indeed. It actually caused a riff a little bit in the tribe because they assumed that my father took the name of Chief. He did not. I think it was just for publicity that they called him Chief just to, make the tabloids happier. But he was in fact not a chief. His name was James Ware, and they called him Running Deer. Yeah,
it's interesting. I think that I can just see the people, the marketing people from Jamestown, thinking possibly we just can't possibly just have running deer, James Ware here working, he has to be a chief.
Right.
So anyway,
Of course.
it's kind of an interesting context from the times,
Yes.
the 1950s and 60s. Okay, a big question for historians concerns the meaning behind memories. I'm really grateful that you're sharing these intimate memories of your family. This is important stuff, and I'm grateful you're sharing that with me. And I want to think about some big picture things. What did it mean to your family and Rappahannock people in general to be part of this living history interpretation?
I could see the pride as a little girl, because I would do the changing of the guard and I'd see him working there all day. Of course, I'd get a little bored staying in the village, so I'd wander around. But I could see the pride when he would present history on not just his people, but all the Powhatan people in Virginia. And I watched the pride, when I would go there on the weekends, of my Aunt Gladys sharing the history, and seeing my Aunt Ethel just very pridefully working on pottery and stuff. I could see the pride in their eyes of my Uncle Captain, when people would ask him questions about the Rappahannock tribe. So indeed, it was very much pride that they could represent not only their people, but share their history with the public.
When I think about the context of the times, 1957, really Virginia is just starting to come out of Jim Crow laws, segregation laws, the one-drop rule. It was difficult to embrace your Indianness, from what I've read, prior to Jamestown 57 and on into the 60s. So this seemed like an important moment for people to be able to say, we are Indian.
Mm-hmm. We were met with a lot of questions, but certainly there at Jamestown, they even put the whites only signs down at the bathrooms when the Queen was to come. We've been met with the prejudice, in the school systems here. My sister and cousins came down here to go to one of the first white Catholic schools and to see if they could absorb the knowledge. And indeed, my cousin Earl Ware, who graduated from Walsingham Academy, did love the school. My sister and my other cousin did not. But we've met with the prejudice here even today. It's less subtle, but it's still there. And, just to present to people, we're very proud of who we are. We're still here. A lot of where I live knows who I am and what I stand for because of how my people stood up and represented themselves.
Well, thank you for sharing that. Before I move on to the next story about Jamestown, I'm intrigued by the story of some of your family members attending school. Tell me a little bit about what kind of educational opportunities there were back at home, maybe in Indian Neck, and why some of your siblings, and family members decided to attend a school in Williamsburg.
Well, when my parents came down here, and when our family came down here, I should say, the kids were invited because the school they were attending was a little small Indian school in the area of the Rappahannock tribe, Indian Neck Road. It was a little small Indian school. The materials that were used to teach the kids was very sub-level to all of the other schools that the non-Indian students were using. It was actually used books from the non-Indian schools that were gifted to the Indian schools, and that's what they were using. And so very oftentimes the education wasn't as great. Most times it was not. So when the invitation came for them to come to Walsingham, they took advantage of it, even though it was as if an experiment to see if they could absorb the knowledge.
Thank you. Historians are very concerned today with the stories of Indian children being removed from their families forcibly. That happened a lot in the, especially out west. Yeah. And so it's important for us to understand today what kind of educational opportunities there were for our Virginia Indians here prior to the 1960s and the end of Jim Crow and racism and based on one drop rule. So it's important for us to understand what that was like.
You're saying after.
Yes.
Well, we were actually in the same schools at that point. I mean, when I went to school, everything was segregated. My sister was at the cusp of the segregation. She was in a predominantly white school here in Williamsburg, and they were having racial riots because, you know, the two dichotomies, the African and Anglican race, were fighting. They had a mixed couple. And there was a major riot in the school, and she was asked to be on one side or the other. And in fact, she called my dad and asked him to come get her. She said, "This is not my fight." And she came home.
And when would that be? Was that in the early 70s?
That was in the 70s.
Okay.
Yeah.
So it seems like a tough place for our Virginia Native Americans where, right, you're not on one side or the other. You're an Indian.
It was tough in the schools because we would always get the question, you know, well, you don't look like a textbook Indian. Well, I'm not a Nez Perce or Cheyenne or Lakota. I am a Rappahannock and I'm Powhatan, and this is the history of our people here. And I even did that when I did outreach in the schools after my degree. I talked to kids about, you know, the importance of knowing yourself. And it just dispelled a lot of myths when I started doing outreach in the schools. But also, as a student in the school, I would educate the students on my ethnicity and why I look like I look and why I feel like I feel. And I think we were all met with that.
Well, thank you for sharing. I want to explore the idea that because of the Jamestown Festival of 1957 and tribal members working there, Rappahannock people became more engaged in the years after the 57 festival with things like cultural preservation, maybe attending powwows, those kinds of things. Being in part of Jamestown re-energized Rappahannock people in the fight really to reclaim their Indian identity. What do you think of that idea?
I think it just solidified, you know, I think it was an impetus for change because our people could make a public appearance in a state-based business or organization to educate who they really were, and they became more visible in the eye of Jamestown Festival Park. But my parents certainly took me to powwows at a very young age. I was 15 when I went to my first powwow in North Carolina and started dancing there. And I've been dancing since I was 15. So, in fact, I think working at Jamestown was an impetus for change, but the feeling was there because many of our people had already started dancing within their own tribes and going to events and activities that weren't as publicized.
Would that be in the 1960s?
Yes, and prior, actually, because I have memories of my mom telling me that a group of them went to Luray Caverns, and up there at the time they were doing some kind of festival, and they were asked to dance up there, and they did, in fact, dance up there. And I think there was many small events around, but they weren't as public, and certainly well known as the impetus for change when Jamestown Festival Park opened.
I'm intrigued by the idea. I know that you are a dancer. Tell me more. I want to know. You said that you first started, your first powwow and first dance was when you were 15?
Yep.
Tell me more about, your interest in this and how you've been involved over the years.
Well, I love the sound of the drum, and I love to dance. So as I met my first friends at the Hallowasaponi powwow, they invited me to come in and pay attention to the drum and dance with the drum because it is the heartbeat of our Mother Earth. And as it started feeling really good, I began, of course my mom was a seamstress, so she started making our outfits for us, our regalia, and she made me my first dress, and I started wearing that powwow. She did much of the bead work Of course, we know the beadwork didn't come along later till after post-colonization, but I wore a lot of jewelry and a lot of beadwork when I danced, and I started when I was 15, and I still wear dresses very similar to what the Powhatan women wore at Jamestown, or what Powhatan women wore, period. I dance now traditional. I have danced fancy, which required a lot more of the post-colonization materials, silk and a lot of glass beadwork. But today I dance traditional.
And are you going to some powwows and dances in this summer?
Yes, I am. My two favorites are the Chickahominy and the Upper Mattaponi, and I love the Mattaponi powwow. The Rappahannocks are going to host a powwow this year. I want to be very much a part of that because I have been dancing. I actually did the first little junior dance group when I was probably in my 20s, and those kids now are older than me, I guess. Anyway, I enjoy teaching them because I've always enjoyed working with kids, so I still dance.
And that would be, so yeah, when you said you started working with kids when you were in your 20s, those were Rappahannock community members?
They were my cousins, and we all danced together. We would go to special events, but people enjoyed watching the little kids dance. The powwows I've traveled to have been as far north as New York, as far south as Florida, as far northwest as the Keweenaw Bay Reservation, where my husband took me to. I've danced traditional by Ojibwe women up there and felt very honored to be with them and learn their culture and tradition from their tribe. My goal is to one day go out west and dance with some of the natives in California and maybe up west. I think, well, I did travel to Washington, and we did dance at powwows in Washington State. When I worked in the Indian program with our chief, Ann Richardson, I love dancing, and I've danced tradition all my life, just about.
I have not attended a powwow in a long time. I probably went to a Nansman, the Nansman tribe from over in Suffolk. Mm-hmm. I went to one of their powwows probably 20 years ago.
Yeah.
So I want to know when the Rappahannocks do something so that I can attend and learn more. So I'll be paying attention for that.
Well, they're saying in our last tribal meeting October-ish, because the Chickahominys is in September, the Mattaponis is in June, the Upper Mattaponis is Memorial Day weekend, the Monicans is the weekend before, and the Nansemans is in August. So what a better time than harvest. So I'm hoping it doesn't mess up my harvest feast I have here every year, but we're planning one in October.
I think it's fascinating when you just reeled that off. I'm hearing the names of our Virginia native tribes today, mm-hmm. and everyone seems to have a powwow or a festival planned celebrating their heritage. Mm-hmm. And I think that's just wonderful.
Well, it's honoring our people. It's honoring our families, and that to say to each other, we're still here. Let's share food, let's share culture, let's share love, let's share our religion. Let's share our tradition, because it's not just Christianity, which we do pray at our powwows, but it's also that drum. And that drum represents our Mother Earth, and it emanates a lot of spirituality that brings our people together in a circle.
Well, thank you. Thank you for that. I'm going to bounce back to 1957 again, because I'm really intrigued with the story of Queen Elizabeth's visit. So Queen Elizabeth II comes to Jamestown in 1957. There are photographs of the Queen observing your mother, Doris Nelson Ware, and your Aunt Gladys Nelson. And I can see a lot of interest in the Queen's face. There is a newspaper account I found in the archives of the Queen stopping and chatting with your mother during her visit. So I want to ask you about, did your family members ever talk about meeting the Queen or other dignitaries during their work, and you know, what did they think of that? What kind of memories do you have of that they had?
I understand Richard Nixon was here. I understand. I do have a photograph of my parents with the Turkish ambassador. There have been others, because I know that in traveling to Colonial Williamsburg, which is right by Jamestown, that other dignitaries have come through Jamestown to Colonial Williamsburg. So I just didn't hear of them.
Well, it's just interesting. And I know that you were involved in a celebration when the Queen came back in 2007. Tell me a little bit about what you and the Virginia community, Indian community here did when the Queen returned in 2007.
Well, we were invited to reincarnate what Jamestown was like, not just from the colonial end, but from the historical end of Jamestown and the original site, Jamestown Settlement, or Jamestown Indian Village on the Jamestown Island. We all came together at the settlement and reincarnated what it was like. The only living relative at that time to re-participate in visiting the Queen was my Aunt Ethel Nelson Trickett and her son Earl Ware, and they invited me in honor of my mother and father. And then certainly my daughter, I also brought my daughter, who's Ojibwe and Rappahannock, into the commemoration of honoring the anniversary and return.
I also want to know more about you visiting England and France. When did that happen, and what kind of activities did you participate in?
Well, from the trip to England, it was simply through the Southern Baptist Mission trip that we were invited, and so a lot of the native Southern Baptist churches were invited. Me and my cousin Nokomis, Fortune Lemons were invited to go from our church, the Rappahannock Church, because we were two of the single ones there. And we traveled over to Gravesend and saw the original St. John's Church, where Pocahontas and John Rolfe are buried, and the original statue that's there. We stayed in London for a bit, and Harrods Department Store is wonderful. But we also traveled the Queen's Court and did a little historic traveling, went into the schools, educated the students about the public and the students about the native history here of the Powhatan Indians. And then the tabloid showed the Red Indians who came over, so we made a little history there. But it was fun networking with the other churches there from the Southern Baptists and seeing some of the baptismal pools and meeting the ministers. So we had a wonderful time.
And when did that happen, Ms. Chandra?
That happened in 1986, 7, 3. It was in the 80s. It was in the 1980s.
Long before the 2007.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely.
Interesting. Okay.
We did. Forgot to mention, we did see the mayor, and he was aware that his queen had come to visit Jamestown in 1957, and we had a little chit chat about that.
This is the mayor of London?
The mayor of Gravesend.
Mayor of Gravesend.
Yes.
Got it.
Yes. We didn't stay in London too long.
Okay.
We ventured out to the Heatherdown area. We stayed more in the little flats around there, and that's where we did the missionary work. But we also incorporated in the missionary work our native culture. So we did a lot of, I think Nokomis did the Lord's Prayer actually in the church in native sign language. And we wore regalia while we were there. But we were also in our church outfits, if you will. So.
Well, thank you. Thank you for sharing that. I am just really honored that you would open up and share these memories and stories with me. I want to make sure that we take the opportunity. Is there anything else that I haven't asked about, or that you just have thought of while we're having our conversation, anything else you want to share today?
I think if we honor each other, regardless of the culture, that we live a more content, peaceful life. I want to, as a Rappahannock woman, but a Native woman, a spiritual woman, honor my people and honor people around me. As a therapist, I inculturate my culture into practice and therapy all the time. I think it's very important to do that. And I think a lot of my clients appreciate that. I carry my husband's blanket that we had wrapped around us when we got married at Hampton University. I carry that, and it's in my office, and I use it as a part of my therapy to not give up. Even though we've lost people we loved in our culture and our path, we still stick to who we are. We never lose sight of where we came from or who we are as an individual.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much for allowing me to be here today.
You're very
And I look
welcome.
forward to talking with you again in the future.
Likewise.